Hello everybody. And first of all, thank you to the Einaudi Foundation for the opportunity to have this discussion. We'll discuss a recent book by Professor Benjamin Nathans from the University of Pennsylvania, which is a monumental research into the history of the dissident movement. In the cases like this, one should start by saying, yes, that's published and worked on, but I prefer to skip this and quote a very old review published in 1953 by Alexander Gershon, which ended with a classic, wonderful, laconic statement. This book must be absolutely be translated into English, replacing English, of course, with Italian. And the book was Franco Venturi's Il Populismus. And I do think that this book should be translated and discussed. And also, of course, I thank Giulia de Florio, who teaches Russian language and culture, who is the president of the Association Memorial Italia, the Italian section of the Memorial Association, has worked on the opposition, resistance in contemporary Russia, and very well qualified to discuss this book, as well as Professor Simone Bellezza, who teaches at the University of Eastern Piedmont, a specialist on Ukrainian history, but he has also published about the Ukrainian dissident, or Шестидесятники, those from the 60s. And so even more, it will be interesting to hear his comment in his dialogue on this overall subject of the history of the Soviet dissidents. So perhaps Giulia wants to start, or Simone, as you wish. Ladies first, yes. And I think we can have two comments by our discussants, reply comments to Ben, and maybe more questions and stuff. Thank you very much. But we must switch places because this is the microphone that works.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers of this event and to Alberto for inviting me. And of course, thank you, Benjamin, for this fascinating, huge work that I had the honor and privilege to read and even to discuss. So I will just start with a few comments, observations, probably, and maybe one or two questions, and then we can go on like this. Well, it's really difficult to sum up all the research inside this book. I would like to just probably mention three things that struck me really while I was reading it. The first thing is that no matter how long this book is and how rich, how much information it contains, when you finish it, you just want to have more. And this may sound paradoxical because when you have this, well, I can show it in the real format, you tend to think that everything was said about that topic. I mean, everything is already covered by the author, every research, every information has been commented on, has been studied, and that's all. But this is not the case, and this is good. This is the real work of a researcher or scholar that gives you the possibility to go farther, to start from here and go farther. And there are a lot of topics that came into my mind while I was reading. for example, the role of women that you mentioned in the book, in some parts of it, and that I think should deserve a real thorough investigation side, because their role was at the same time really important, as you underline, because without Bagaraz and Gorbanevskaya, for example, probably the dissident movement, I wouldn't say that shouldn't exist or wouldn't exist, but it would be really different. And on the other hand, of course, the dissident movement as a whole was quite masculine-centered. And all the heroes you talk about are more or less, well, almost all male. So this is the first topic. And the other one that I think could be and should be really looked into is the dynamic between the center and the periphery. You mentioned the Soviet dissidents as a huge phenomenon that covered all the territory of the, let's say, Soviet Union, of course, mainly the Russian part, but how the dynamic of the smaller city towards the center worked is a very important aspect that you cover in some part, in some chapters of the book, but again, it could be even more investigated. This is the first observations that really it was a pleasure to see how much work has been done and can be done in the future. The second things I think I would like to underline is that I really appreciated not only the approach and the methodology. Of course, we are talking about one of the best historians of this topic, but your constant attention to the movement, the dissident movement, as a Soviet project, and the way you studied these biographies, these lives, as part of the system they were fighting. And this is really, really important, because the difference is that we tend to think that the dissident movement had a very important goal that was to build a new future, and that was not the case, because they were just trying to exit a totalitarian past. And sometimes this aspect of trauma they were dealing with is not, in my opinion, is a bit underestimated. They were exiting either in the first person or by their background, by their family, from the 30s, from the Second World War, so from a chain of traumatic experiences that, of course, as extraordinary people, felt even more and had a deeper understanding than the rest of the society. And so this probably, in my opinion, and I can already pose this as a question, this in part generated a sort of, let's say, complex or schizophrenic attitude towards an array of questions they were dealing with, ranging from the value of truth, the role of the collective, even the collective blame, the collective responsibility of the society, the relationship between the masses and the elites, which they belong to, and this background, this traumatic experience really modified their way of thinking and their way of perceiving themselves inside the society. And the third thing that I think it's really worth the whole research is the way you analyze the inner dynamics of the movement, the evolution inside the dissident movement. We tend to think that dissidents were all the same, were really brave people that fought for the freedom of speech, for the freedom of assembly, and they were more or less all the same. And this is really not the case when we talk about dissident movements. They were really different. They were there was a lot of inner arguing and confrontations between them, and you highlight all the different, let's say, opinions or points of view. And this is another question that I was thinking about when I was reading the book. The question of identity inside the movement. I mean, you read a lot of biographies, a lot of material, biographies of the dissidents. What struck me is how did they perceive themselves? Because in another talk I was listening to before coming here, you mentioned that none of these people wanted to be named and considered as dissident, which is a really Russian feature. I mean, I studied songwriters like Vysotsky, Akujava, Galich. Nobody wanted to be marked as songwriters, or even worse, like dissident or something like that. Galich was a playwright, Akujava was a writer, prose writer, and Vysotsky was an actor. And well, of course, everybody knows them because they sang songs, really important songs, but they rejected this sort of markings. And the dissidents apparently had the same problem of identity. And they were physicians, biologists, engineers, but at the same time, they wanted to do something very different rather than studying and being just scholars in their field. So how did you approach this question of identity, and what kind of questions the material you analyzed have brought to your attention? That's just a start. Thank you.
Great. So, good evening, everyone. I would like to thank Alberto Masoero and the Einaudi Foundation for organizing and hosting this event, allowing us to discuss this wonderful book. Since I'm going to be quite critical of this book, I would like to immediately set the record straight by saying that I think that this is a wonderful book, an incredibly well-researched book, a compelling reading, because I have to say, yes, it is a long book, but you read it very fast. It's not that it takes you 3 months to read a long book, because you want to go on and to see what's coming after what you've already read. And I do suggest everyone interested in the history of dissent and even international relations of the Cold War to read it. I think that nowadays it is increasingly difficult to find time to read long books and books that long like Benjamin Atten's books. So when we read these books, we really want them to be worth it. And I think that this is really a book worth reading. This is a book from which I learned a lot. Many things that I didn't know or things that I didn't understand sufficiently well, and that now are clearer, are presented in a context that allowed me a deeper understanding. So I'm really happy, and I mean, I compliment you with this incredible achievement. Just to give you a few examples, because then I'm going to criticize them. I think that one has to substantiate. For example, I mean, the study of the relationship between the dissidents and Amnesty International and the Soviet Union as a third part is really admirably told in a couple of chapters of the last part of the book. And I think this is a relatively new field of research, but it is bringing like really interesting research. There's something very original in this book. And I said relatively new because I'm also working on the relationship between Ukrainian dissidents and the West. And I must admit that I remember very well that I was inspired exactly exactly by reading another essay by Benjamin Adams a few years ago in a book edited by Samuel Moyne, something like that, that gave me the idea that this was like a new field of research. So I have to acknowledge that you pointed me in the right direction. Another thing that I absolutely didn't know and that really struck me, and this is also one first question for you, if you have some further information about it, if possible. I don't know, because it's a very small detail, but still really interesting for me, was to discover that the Human Rights Committee wanted to study the issue of gay rights, among other things. So I am one of those who grew up thinking that the only Soviet person interested in sexual and gender minorities was the very famous Igor Kon. And so it would be really interesting now to know something more about the relationship between this classical dissent and what now is called the gender and sexual dissent, like a form of dissenting from the robot. So in a nutshell, I think that this is a book. This book is both a first-hand, in-depth research on documents and also an effort to synthesize the many studies that have been published on this topic. And I truly believe that this is a must-read for anyone who wants to approach this topic in the future. So now I can start with the criticism, and I will unleash the Ukrainian nationalist in me, because I have to warn you also that, of course, my reading is mainly from a Ukrainian point of view, because the reality that I've studied, that I know, is the Ukrainian reality. So many years ago, when I had just finished writing my book on the Ukrainian Шестидесятники, a reviewer from a publishing house that ultimately decided not to publish my book, attacked me quite violently for what they saw as the main flaw in my research, which they called navel gazing. Essentially, the problem was that I had not dealt with that I had dealt only with Ukrainian dissidents without trying to find out how the history of Ukrainian dissidents could lead to an increase in knowledge of the broader history of Soviet dissent. Apart from the fact that I don't think that now that reviewer, with whom I have to say I have an excellent term, and very excellent term today, I will tell you during the dinner who it is, not now, but I would say I don't think that the reviewer would today say the same things after 2022. But I do believe that if we applied that category of judgment to this book, we could get the same result. My first criticism of this book is that this book, allow me to say, it has the wrong subtitle. Not the many lives of the Soviet dissent movement, but the many lives of the Russian dissent movement. Or perhaps even, as Giulia already mentioned, of the Muscovite, because it's a very center. This book is essentially about the events that took place in the center, in Moscow, and the geographical dimension is somewhat lost. Even when it talks about like Sakharov, was in Moscow, was not, we know he wasn't living in Moscow. This is a fact that remains in the shadow. Was Leningrad the center of similar or different activities compared to Moscow? Like, did the authorities behave differently in Moscow, in Leningrad, in Novosibirsk, in Kiev? And I would like to know more about this, because, for example, in the Ukrainian case, the things that one could do like in Donetsk, in Kiev, in Lviv, were very different. So, and this kind of like geographical dimension is interesting. Furthermore, I do not want to criticize navel gazing per se, because I think that it's absolutely legitimate to focus on certain communities, and so it's absolutely normal. But I think that it is clear that to properly, Is everything fine with the microphone? Yes, okay. To properly evaluate how much this group of intellectuals that operated in Moscow was truly original and did things for the first time in Soviet history, we need to know what other intellectuals were doing. The point is to understand if what was being done in Moscow was the acme, this is my sensation, my feeling, was the acme of processes that had already developed as well elsewhere. I will give you an example. The opening thesis of Volping, being the creator of the technique of, I would say, law-abiding strategy, was, I mean, it's true, it was perhaps actually systematized only by Volpin, but I remember that it was also used by Ukrainian. And I'm referring to, for example, the jurist Lev Kolukyanenko, who was arrested in 1971. So what I would say is that perhaps it would be more a question of understanding where these common characteristics of the resistance to Soviet power originated, more than like, and Moscow was somehow the final point of a longer process. I don't know if you agree with that or not. For another example, the public appeal against the Article 190, which is presented as the first time that esteemed Soviet intellectuals have addressed the Soviet Supreme with an open letter. I mean, it's perhaps indeed the first time in that particular form. But for example, Ukrainian intellectuals had already addressed similar appeals to the Ukrainian authorities against the educational reform in 1958, 1959, and it was like the elite of the intellectuals in Soviet Ukraine. So, I mean, the value of the action done at the center remains, but you understand it more as an evolution of like other streams of the history of dissent. An action done first in the periphery, perhaps the less dangerous periphery, no, like in Ukraine, you did something first in Donetsk, then if it was permitted in Donetsk, you could reply it in Kyiv, and then in Lviv, or if you did something first in Lviv, that it was automatically possible to do it also in Lviv and in Donetsk, in Kyiv and in Donetsk. So, I mean, as I anticipated, I mean, I am not opposed to the principle of the so-called navel-gazing. So also, reading this book, I was able to notice all the huge differences that exist between the dissent movement in Russia and Ukraine. I will focus on one particular issue because I believe that it allows to bring out a fundamental point on which I would like to ask you for more clarification. In several parts of the books, the topic of the search for historical antecedents for the dissident movements and its relationship with the intelligentsia of the Tsarist era is addressed and treated. In the Ukrainian case, what you call the usable past, usable past most frequently referred to is not a distant past as for the Russians, but is the Soviet-Ukrainian cultural revival of the 1920s, the so-called short Renaissance. And this brings me to the ideological element of dissent. In the Ukrainian case, I would say, dissidenti believed strongly in socialism. They were true believers in communism. And so they did not perceive themselves as dissidents, and they did not perceive the USSR as an enemy at all. The Ukrainian dissidenti perceived themselves as the best result of the Soviet society and wanted to improve the USSR and not to fight it. This is exactly why, I mean, if you are like swimming in shit, as you, I mean, tell the story of that anecdote, no? Why do you make the wave? Because you don't think that it should be shit. It should be something different. And so you have a right to like modify reality because you believe in it. It's your own reality. It's not something belonging to someone else. And so, and what I think is perhaps, and this is like a question also of chronology, I think that at least in the Ukrainian case, you cannot really speak of dissent until the repressions of 1972. Which made it clear to everyone that the possible reforms of the Soviet Union were not allowed anymore, if they were ever possible. But still, I mean, they still were like disillusioned, perhaps, but they thought that until 1972, they could still somehow participate in the process of reforming the Soviet Union. So you cannot really think of proper dissent, even if, I mean, starting from 1968, they already had started to have a feeling that something changed. And I was wondering about the book. So the book treats figures who still believed in communism, such like, I think not incidentally, Ukrainian General Grigorenko or Sakharov, but they are like treated like not really representative of the intellectual and ideological evolution of the Russian dissent. So I would like to elaborate a little more on what was the, I would ask, what are the real reasons why dissidents decided to become dissidents? And there is also like a generational factor that needs to be explained. Like you wrote that in the dissent, there was a factor of opposition between fathers and sons, a sort of generational like difference. But I would like to understand better how these generations are identified, are different. Like Daniel and Siniavsky were born in the 1920s. Bukovsky was born in 1942, I think. So it's quite different. Also, the relationship with like Stalinism, the level of involvement with Stalinism is different. So can you tell a little more about what you meant when you said there is like a question of relationship of generational differences? Also, I find a little like problematic to agree with the statement that the KGB was no longer interested in the ideological element of dissent. I believe that they were actually very much interested in what the dissenters thought. So much so that the practices of prophylactica, and I don't know if you would agree with that, were sometimes also aimed at convincing potential dissidents not to become dissidents. So I would read it like that it was a longer process. So when looking at the Ukrainian case once again, until 1972, accusation of siding with capitalist countries deeply hurt the Shizdesyal. And the KGB, as well as the writers' unions, the Ukrainian writers' unions, sincerely trying to obtain like retractions and reformulations and of the nonconformist intellectuals. So then, of course, there was a moment in which it was decided that an individual was lost. So, and the only aim left was to isolate it and punish it. So, but the KGB was aware of the difference, in my opinion, when somebody was still possible to be like convinced of the justness of the Soviet Union or not. And I think that like this quote of Alexandrovsky when he's talking with Krasin of you don't believe in communism anymore, and if you want, I can find it. I mean, this in a way confirms this idea. On the repressions, I also feel like adding that we must never forget that it was a violent repression. I feel I must stress, in addition to what is written in the book, that the injection administered in mental hospitals were not only mentally debilitating, but also incredibly painful, physically painful, and they constituted in all respect like corporal torture. And furthermore, in the gulags in the 1970s, in the 1980s, even under Gorbachev, people died. At least the Ukrainians died. I don't know the Russians. Perhaps, do you feel that the Russians were treated better in the gulags in respect to Ukrainians? Like Stus died with Gorbachev already being the general secretary of the Communist Party. So also, I would say that I have to disagree with the consideration also on the afterlife of dissent, at least as far as Ukraine is concerned. Also because we have to try to understand why, after 1991, Ukraine slowly moved towards a democratic transformation while Russia did not. It is not true that the Ukrainian dissidents, even those of the 1950s and 60s, were not politically active subjects after 1991. It is not true, for example, that Plush or Mykola Rudenko were abroad in 1991. They both came back to Ukraine in 1990, and they starting from there, they lived like a double life, both in France or in the United States and in Ukraine, but then more and more in Ukraine than in other countries. And I would say that with the only exception of Lina Kostenko, who never loved active political life, all the others like Lukyanenko, Dzuba, Chornovil, Drach, Moroz, Sherbak, all became active politicians, each founded his own party, and if they and if they have attracted criticism, it was precisely for not having been able to interpret a more super partes political role in independent Ukraine. The first dissident I met in 2009 was Les Stanyuk, who was a member of the parliament back then, and he introduced me President Yushchenko and like brought me around in his like state car. So they were politicians after 1991, the dissidents. And so perhaps this is one of the reasons why we do not have a democracy in Russia. Where did the Russian dissidents end up? The Ukrainian dissidents were different. And finally, and the difference with the Ukrainian dissidents, it is a difference that struck me the most, is that, I mean, I had this feeling, and I have to say, you are really honest with the topic of your research. In Italian, there is and especially you're not making any discounts. You are very like truthful, and you are like presenting reality like that. You are not. I mean, I don't have the feeling that you are in love with the topic you are studying. You have like you're distant. You're keeping distance. So Russian dissidents were all a little too individualistic, and there was very little sense of group. I mean, even after 1972, in my opinion, the real I mean. Even if, I mean, not all the dissidents became actually dissidents, but still, I mean, the feeling of the group was there. They were very close friends with a very strong sense of belonging to a community characterized by reciprocal love. They would never put someone else's signature on a document without permission. They were incredibly interested in each other, both professionally and artistically, as well as personally. And most importantly, their friendship lasted until death. I mean, when I interviewed the Shizdesyatniki like 15 years ago for the first time in 2009, I discovered actually that they were calling each other on the phone after our interviews to exchange opinions about what question I was making and what ideas did I have. And they were very strong, close friends, even in 2009. And so, I mean, when I told Lina Kostenko that I wanted to interview Lev Kolyukanenko, I got scolded. Because for her, as well as for all the others of the group, Lukyanenko was not the group. So even if it was not formalized, the Ukrainian Shizdesyatniki had a very strong feelings of the group. The group is these people that they didn't need like to pay a membership to know, but there were people that were outside. And that friendship, I mean, I cannot really find it. You mentioned friendship sometimes in the book, but this remains the question, was this still there? Did they remain friends even, I mean, through the decades of Soviet repressions? Because this is something like very interesting, perhaps peculiar of the Ukrainian case. And but of course, I mean, I'm willing to be proven wrong on this. So, and thank you very much. Yes.
As long as Simone can be with them.
Thank you, not just for the commentaries, but for spending so much time with the book and care with the book. I want to begin by thanking all of you for coming to an English language event. It feels a little imposing of me to do this, but trust me, you wouldn't want to hear me try to do it in Italian. I want to thank Alberto Masoero for making this event possible. He's the one who brought us all together and had the idea that this might be an interesting conversation. And of course, the Einaudi Foundation is hosting us in this very, for me, poetic room that we're in right now. I'm going to say a few things about why I wrote this book before I attempt to address some, I don't think I can do all, but some of the really important questions that my colleagues have raised. I wrote this book because I developed a curiosity about how people who live in authoritarian societies think about their political options, how they imagine what opportunities, if any, for public political engagement there might be, and then, of course, how and why they choose to act on those ideas. That's really what got me interested in the Soviet dissidents in the first place. I'm trained as an historian of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, so that was my natural case study. But I recognized at the time that this was a question that could be put to any number of countries. And when I say at the time, I mean, I started this book in the mid-2000s. So it was a very long process of research and writing. What I never imagined was that that question could be put or would be put to my own country, to the United States. And in a way that is still extremely strange to me, the resonance of the book among its American readers, not that there are that many, but the commentary on the book in the United States has been very much about what this says to us as Americans dealing with the Donald Trump administration and the sense that all of a sudden these issues and these controversies and these techniques of self-expression under increasingly undemocratic forms they're questions that we have to now think about in a new way. So I suppose you could say that this book is, the millionth example of the way you can never predict how a book will be read, because the political and cultural context is always changing, and therefore the interests and the questions that, and the concerns and the fears that people bring to a story like this are changing. Now, I'm looking out at the room and I'm seeing a lot of people who look like students. So I hope I'm not wrong in assuming that, but I do want to say another thing about why I wrote this book, because I think it pertains to why almost every book that I've known got written, which is that the author felt a sense of dissatisfaction with the received wisdom. Something is not right about the way people have been talking about this topic, where people have fallen victim over and over again to a kind of naive set of assumptions when they're writing about it. I'm saying this to anybody who's a student in the room because I believe that that sense of dissatisfaction is probably the single most powerful driver of intellectual work. You're always in dialogue and disagreeing with someone, whether you choose to acknowledge it in your introduction or not. That dialectic, that argument is there in one form or another, and it certainly applies to me in this book. And there were two things in particular as I started learning about the dissident movement in the Soviet Union that started to just feel wrong to me. The first was the way the existing literature, and this is long before your book on the Shistizatniki came out. I'm talking about books that were written by journalists at the time or the earliest historians. It was very hagiographic. They treated the dissidents as saints who could do no wrong. And worse than that, they reproduced the story that the movement was telling about itself. which is an important story, but you never want to become hostage to the story that your historical actors tell about themselves. So that was one of the things that made me increasingly uneasy about what I was finding. The other thing, and this took a while after I started doing my own research, is that I discovered that the most famous dissidents, the people whose names became known really all over the world, or certainly the Western world, but I think not only the Western world. I have in mind, some of them have been mentioned, the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, or the physicist Andrei Sakharov, or in some years, Anatoly Sharansky, now Natan Sharansky, the Jewish refusnik and dissident activist who eventually served 9 years in prison and then emigrated to Israel. These names were taken as the leaders of the movement and the people through whom we could exemplify what the movement was about. And the more I started learning about it, the more I realized that that was totally wrong. They were never the leaders of the movement. And they were what people were responsible for it across its 20-year evolution. So that's the real meaning of the subtitle of the book, right? The title of the book is To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, which is a toast that dissidents, not only dissidents, but especially dissidents would make over kitchen tables in Moscow and Kiev and Leningrad and many other cities. The subtitle of the book is The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. And I wanted to recover the many lives that have been lost to historical memory, whose names are not only unknown in the West, but are largely unknown in Russia itself. And I can prove that because we have public opinion polls that show it. There's a second meaning to the subtitle. It's a bit of a play on words. The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement refers to the fact that the movement underwent several near-death experiences. When it was almost completely crushed and eliminated, it survived those near-death experiences, but it had to reinvent itself, reformat itself each time. And that is something that I think had also not yet been fully explored in the literature about the movement. It was taken as sort of one thing from start to finish with one ethos and sort of one format for the way it operated. Excuse me. There's a lot more that I could say about the book, but I don't want to go on for too long. And we can follow up on any of these issues if there are questions from the audience. But let me turn, at least briefly, to some of the comments of my fellow panelists. The book does try to show that the many lives of the movement included a large number of women, and they especially seem to have disappeared from the historical record. Not only the historical record, but the contemporary coverage of the movement. This was a movement whose entire existence unfolded during the Cold War. And much of the most acute coverage of the movement in real time, as we say, that is, as things were actually happening, was by Western journalists who were posted in Moscow, people who were writing for newspapers in Germany, Italy, France, the United States, Great Britain. Every single one of those Western correspondents was male, without exception. And while there were some enormously talented journalists among them, I don't want to be condescending to the work that they did at all, but they carried with themselves certain blind spots about who was a likely candidate for leader of this movement. And when they focused on individuals, they seem to have always focused on the male members of the movement, despite abundant evidence at the time that women were playing a central role in the creation of samizdat, those self-published texts that were retyped by hand and disseminated all across the Soviet Union, that women were, in a sense, crucial for the movement's survival across those near-death experiences, because the Soviet regime, the KGB, for its own reasons, tended to prefer to arrest men demonstrators, even though there were plenty of women demonstrators. This, for example, is why you'll find in Western newspaper coverage of the movement in the 1970s and 80s, journalists referring to Mrs. Sakharov instead of Yelena Bonner, or Mrs. Daniel instead of Larisa Bogoraz, or Mrs. Sinyavsky instead of Maria Rozanova. And that naming pattern for me was emblematic of what was getting missed in the journalistic coverage. So both of the commentators have remarked on issues of center and periphery. And this is certainly not the first time the book has been criticized for being too Moscow-centric. They've also drawn attention to the vocabulary of naming the protagonists of the book dissidents, even though they themselves, almost without exception, really didn't like that term. And I struggled for a long time about whether I should not use that term and sort of impose a kind of intellectual discipline on myself by not using it. I would have loved to have done that, but I couldn't think of a better alternative. And so much of the source material that I was working with used the term dissident, even if not in a happy way, that I felt it would have been excruciating to try to quote from the sources and find myself once again using that term. The reasons that dissidents didn't like that term, as you remarked, is that didn't and couldn't for them really encapsulate their identities. Many of these people were very professionally accomplished. Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov were both Nobel Prize winners. Solzhenitsyn for literature, Sakharov for peace, but Sakharov was a world-renowned physicist, and others were, if maybe not at that level, also quite respected in their professions, and they wanted to be known for that more than for their dissident activity. But there's a deeper problem with the term dissident that has to do not so much with professional identity as with political categories. So in the Western world, anybody who had a disagreement with the Soviet government and was public about it was referred to as a dissident. So they could be a Ukrainian struggling for greater Ukrainian cultural autonomy or for the dignity of Ukrainian poetry, art. They could be a neo-Leninist who thought that the Soviet Union had lost its way, had lost the spirit of the Bolshevik Revolution, needed to be reoriented towards the true aspirations of Marxism-Leninism. They could be anything under the sun, ideologically speaking. And the problem with this Western definition of dissident is that it throws many, many people into the same pot who really have almost nothing in common except their disagreement with the state. And at a certain point, I decided to use a very Soviet definition of dissident, which was someone who wanted to use the legal system to contain the behavior of the Soviet state. As you both mentioned, their aspiration was never to overthrow the state or even to significantly transform the state. None of them aspired to seize power themselves. They simply wanted to put certain limits on what the Soviet government could do to its citizens. The Soviet definition of dissent is much narrower, and therefore, for me, was much more analytically powerful and useful. So part of Simone's concern about this book is the insufficient attention that it gives to Ukrainians. And your argument could be multiplied for Lithuanians or Armenians or Georgians, or for that matter, evangelical Christians, and perhaps the largest group of all, Russian nationalists, who ended up becoming a huge force. For me, the problem with that argument is that I don't really think of those people as dissidents. I think of them as autonomists or religious believers or nationalists. That doesn't diminish the significance of what they're doing, but it means it's a different story. What I was interested in this book was the communication between the so-called rights defenders, the pravozащитники, sort of dissidents, capital D, and people who had a slightly different agenda. That is greater cultural autonomy, or in the case of Lithuania, outright independence and eventually secession from the Union. I do think that the language of legal dissent and the idea of leveraging Soviet law became something like a lingua franca that allowed these groups to talk to each other. But my book is really about the Soviet definition of dissidents, and it really privileges those who tried to leverage law and the courts and the Constitution and the Code of Criminal Procedure. You've written a fantastic book about the Ukrainian scene, and I don't feel, first of all, my book is already so long that if I had tried to do justice to Ukraine or Lithuania or evangelical Christians or Russian nationalists, the book would have become completely impossible. It would have been like a telephone book. Well, I don't know if you guys know what a telephone book is, but in the old days, there used to be a book listing everybody's name and number. And in many of the earliest histories of Soviet dissent, including those by practitioners like Lyudmila Alexeyeva, are literally, a chapter on Lithuania, a chapter on Ukraine, a chapter on Russia. I didn't want to write a book like that. I wanted a thematic focus and not a kind of grand tour of the Soviet Union. The other thing I'll say, and I think this is a bit controversial, but I'll say it anyway, is that from our own perspective, we may want to decenter Moscow, decenter Russia in this federation, decolonize Russian historical narratives. But my own belief is that the Soviet Union, like the Russian Empire, was an extremely Moscow-centered political system. You can like that, you can not like it, but Moscow really was the nerve center of the country. And this is why so many, for example, Ukrainian and Lithuanian dissidents ended up visiting Moscow on their way to visiting people in the camps. And that became an important source of mutual conversation and recognition among them and the rights defenders, strictly defined. So I guess my response to your criticism would be to say, these stories of the non-Russian republics absolutely deserve to be told, but nothing for me is ever going to change the fact that this was an extremely centralized country, politically, intellectually, infrastructurally, and that therefore Moscow was always going to have an outsized role compared to any other city. Of course, there were significant dissidents in Odessa, in Leningrad, in Kiev, and in Novosibirsk and other Soviet cities. But I can't pretend that they were positioned in the same way as those in Moscow. Let me say a few things about some of the areas of dissent that did not get that much attention in the book. Gay rights is one of them. Women's rights is another. We could add to this list disability rights, the specific rights of workers, all kinds of groups. So I only discovered that Valery Chalidze, who was a physicist and the founding member of the Moscow Human Rights Committee, I only discovered that he had written a legal brief about gay rights in the Soviet Union because it appeared in an obituary in a Western newspaper. Literally. No, I never heard a single mention of that issue from dissident sources themselves. And I think that tells us something about how marginalized that topic became. And I would say pretty much the same thing about women's rights. The so-called rights defenders had a very traditional, hierarchical view of rights. And their attitude was freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. That's the highest level. And we need to get those fixed before we can deal with so-called second-tier issues like women's rights. Again, you can like this, you can not like it, You can think it's blind, you can think it's backward, but that hierarchy existed, just like the hierarchy between Moscow and the rest of the country. So I think, that's what I found in my research, is this very elitist sense of civil liberties as being the crown jewels of this struggle, and everything else had to take a back seat. It reminded me very much of the way the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks argued in the late 19th century when confronted with demands by Poles or Ukrainians or Jews for national rights. Their answer was, first the revolution, then we'll get to your problems. This sense of there being a natural historical hierarchy, in sequence to these issues. Okay, just a few very short comments because I do want to leave time for more discussion. Simone is absolutely right that there were parallel phenomena in Ukraine, and you analyze these in your book, that are just amazingly similar to the legal approach. And what's in some ways equally amazing is that the two sides seem to have had almost no awareness of each other until the 1970s. It's extraordinary to think that people in the same country were groping their way to new ways of thinking and new techniques in major cities like Moscow and Kiev, and were literally not aware of each other's existence. Then again, it's also extraordinary that all of the scientists in this movement, and it's one of the striking things about the dissident movement, that there were so many computer scientists and physicists and mathematicians and engineers, that they were busily and very creatively discussing legal issues that the professional lawyers in the Soviet Union were also interested in, and there was no dialogue between them. The extreme version of what I'm saying would be this. There was no such thing as Soviet society. There was just a Soviet population. And inside that population were many, many different small, intimate, face-to-face communities, inside which there was a very high degree of trust and loyalty and friendship, but between which there was a very high level of distrust and suspicion. Again, this is the extreme version of the argument. It doesn't make sense to talk about society. All we have was a kind of demographic population and an archipelago of face-to-face communities. Now, I have to disagree with your last point about friendship. The friendships among the Moscow dissidents were extremely intense. They outlived the collapse of the Soviet Union. I myself attended several reunions of dissidents, people who had known each other for now 40, 50 years, who came in from all corners of the earth, Europe, North America, Israel, and you could see that these were indeed lifelong attachments. So it wasn't just the Ukrainians who had the sense that this was a friendship until death. That was absolutely true among those in Moscow. I'm avoiding saying among the Russians because the Moscow dissidents were very multi-ethnic themselves. There were a lot of Jews, also ethnic Russians, but there were also people of Ukrainian descent who were part of the Moscow circles. So it's tricky to use the ethnic categories in many of these cases. One dissident once told me that he thought the friendships in the dissident community were usually stronger than the marriages, which I think if you look at the record of who divorced who and who was sleeping with who, I think you'll probably agree that that was the case. These adult friendships were extremely intense. And they give the lie to the cliche about totalitarian societies that they atomize populations. I mean, coming from the United States, I can tell you, I and many other people have been struck at the intensity and duration of adult friendships in the Soviet Union and in Russia today. Not the atomization, just the opposite. I also would take issue with the comment about the KGB and its interest or lack of interest in what dissidents believed. So for me, it's it's easy to come to my conclusion if your point of departure or your comparative framework is the 1930s. If you read interrogation transcripts from the 1930s during the Great Terror, first of all, these are fantastic documents. They're like the records of the Spanish Inquisition. I mean, the security agents, the NKVD agents, they are boring into the souls of their victims. They want to know their innermost thoughts, their innermost beliefs, how they came to those beliefs. It's an incredible inquisition. If you read, and I've read a lot of interrogation transcripts from the 60s and 70s, they don't even ask the questions. They just want to use the witness or the victim to extract more useful information about, well, who did you know? And who did you get your samizdat from? How can we widen the scope of the investigation? But there's just a remarkable apathy about belief and commitment. So based on the evidence that I saw, I would stand by the claim that the KGB had a very different agenda in the conversations that it conducted, and even the prophylactic conversations, which were typically with people a little bit younger, high school students who they were trying to prevent from going down the wrong path. Even those conversations, at least the ones that I've seen records of, tended to be more about, tell us about your family. Is there trouble in the home? Looking for explanations for dissenting behavior that had nothing to do with belief, all sort of circumstantial and contextual. I think the KGB was trying to professionalize itself, and that's one of the reasons why it got out of the business of, Spanish Inquisition or Roman Inquisition style interrogations. But I would stand by the generalization. Okay, there's much more that could be said. I'm very grateful for the care and attention that you gave to the book, but I think it's better to have more of a dialogue.
No, stay. Yeah, let's ask for questions so that you can answer.
Okay.
So the invitation is for the audience. If any of you has question, remarks, for the Russian-speaking students in Russian as well, if you wish. Пожалуйста. Не стесняйтесь. Yes, and I also have, Vladimir,
Come to them.
can you come here to the Vladimir? We only have one microphone here, so you can ask in Russian.
Yeah, if it's possible, I will ask in Russian.
Давайте.
Я бы хотел спросить, еврейская роль в диссидентском движении Советского Союза, какова она была? Была ли она основной? И было, так как мы знаем, что было много евреев в диссидентском движении, потому что из-за дискриминации, которые были в Советском Союзе, и из-за других аспектов. Но вот хотел бы я узнать по поводу еврейской роли.
Maybe.
Should I translate the question? Okay, so thank you. The question was about the role of Jews in the Soviet dissident movement, why they came to the movement, and what impact they had on the movement. There were quite a few people of Jewish descent in the movement. And as a matter of fact, there was kind of a joke about that, more than one. Any of you who are familiar with Soviet culture know that everything you need to know about the Soviet Union you can find in anecdote. They are the most efficient, memorable, and flavorful encapsulation of that time and place. So the joke about Jews in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet dissident movement, was from a poet named Naum Kurjavin, who once said, "I am very upset that 85% of the dissident movement are Jews. It should be 50-50 Jews, Russians." So the joke was Jews comprised less than 2% of the Soviet population. So 50-50 would have been almost as absurd as 85%. I forgot to mention that Soviet anecdotes are very difficult to translate and keep them from being funny. But no, the truth is that Jews were massively overrepresented in the movement. But the reasons why are not so easy to identify. I mean, you mentioned correctly that there was discrimination against Jews in the Soviet Union, and that took the form of quotas on their admissions to institutions of higher education. They were kept out of certain professions for security reasons. All of that is true, but it's also true that in some ways, Soviet Jews were the great success story of Soviet history. They were more likely than average to live in desirable cities like Kyiv and Moscow and Leningrad. They were more likely than the non-Jewish population to enter into elite professions like physics, chess, filmmaking. So it's not a simple picture, the place of Jews in Russian and Soviet society. And I think it should also be said that many of the people who we think of as Jewish dissidents, and there are a lot of them, were not really culturally Jewish. They didn't speak any Jewish languages. They had no Jewish education. They were Jewish in the Soviet sense of being descended from people who were marked in their passports as belonging to the Jewish minority. So the more closely you look, the more slippery the question becomes. And just to add another variable into the conversation, people in the West often confuse dissidents and refuseniks. So refuseniks were Jews who had applied for permission to leave the country, to go to Israel, and who had been denied permission for whatever reason. But most refuseniks were not dissidents. As a matter of fact, most refuseniks didn't want to have anything to do with the dissident movement because their agenda was to leave, whereas the dissident agenda was to reform the system. So that the refuseniks looked at the dissidents and said, I don't want to get tangled up with those people because that will get me in all kinds of political trouble. I actually have a separate article about the relationship between the refuseniks and the dissidents. It didn't make it into the book, but I'd be happy to share it with you if you want to see it. It is in English. Here's where we come to a really interesting question. So I struggled for many years to try to come up with an explanation for why Jews were so overrepresented in the movement. I also struggled for years to come up with an explanation for why scientists are so overrepresented in the movement. And the barrier that I kept hitting over and over again was that whatever I could come up with by way of cultural characteristics, cognitive habits, scientists are engaged in a kind of organized skepticism. They're trained to be skeptical. They're trained to have certain rigorous criteria about what constitutes truth. They exist in a professional world that's highly cosmopolitan, where people are interested in research that's been done all over the world. And for the Jews, you could say, well, they're a persecuted minority and they bring with them this long-standing habit of being suspicious of state power. Whatever you want to put on the list, the problem that would never go away for me was that the overwhelming majority of Soviet Jews never were dissidents and never wanted to become involved with the movement. And similarly, the overwhelming majority of Soviet scientists never wanted to have anything to do with the movement because they thought either it was just flat out wrong or they thought it would jeopardize their relationship with the state. And the state, of course, was the provider of funding for the research that they desperately wanted to do. So at the end of the day, at least in my own mind, those generalizations just don't work. They don't withstand scrutiny. And so instead, I looked for other factors having to do with this pattern of people sort of stumbling into some kind of morally upsetting encounter with the Soviet state, often with the KGB. You'll appreciate this. For many, it was in their student years, they were asked to inform on fellow students. And this produced a kind of conscience, a crisis of conscience for them. It pitted their patriotism against their friendship, which was an impossible struggle. Or it took the form of being pressured to sign a denunciation against somebody. These are very, very common phenomena in the Soviet Union. So dissidents were people who encountered those stumbling blocks, as I call them, moral stumbling blocks, and who decided as a result that they could not cooperate with the state and eventually joined the movement in opposition to what the state was doing. This is one of the reasons why, as you pointed out, the book insists that Soviet dissidents were very Soviet people. They were very high-minded. It was the people who experienced a crisis of conscience because of their Soviet moral values who eventually made their way towards the movement. It's kind of paradoxical, but I think that's actually the case.
Yeah, I want to ask is the importance of friendship in this dissident movement is because of the fear of the repression by the state.
Thank you. The first thing I should say is that powerful adult friendships among men, among women, between men and women were characteristic of Soviet society generally. This is yet another way in which the dissidents mirror the society from which they come. There was a kind of a cult of friendship in the 1960s, especially, harking back to some of the more famous examples from the 19th century, Herzen and Ogarev being the paradigm for this. It's not so much that friendships protected you from the KGB as that friendship was more often than not what motivated people to go out and protest, because as they put it, I couldn't stand seeing my friends go out and not be there with them. It wasn't, I agreed with their politics, or I wanted to promote the agenda of this particular demonstration. It was, I just cannot bear the feeling of my friends being out there, being vulnerable to arrests, to getting beaten up or whatever. And I will be in my apartment, or I'll be, down the street watching it happen. That sense of solidarity, even in moments of danger, was, I just found it over and over. And this was a problem for the KGB because it's what inspired people not to inform on their friends and not to denounce them. But it wasn't really a form of protection.
Yeah, I may add something about this last point also about friendship. Yeah, this is really a funny game. I think friendships and friends were the only people you can talk frankly about everything. It's difficult for us and for you especially to think how Soviet people lived in their society, where every day, every time, somebody was lying to you. It was a huge lie. You were inside a huge lie, and you recognized it. And so friends were the people with whom you could tell the truth, whatever truth you wanted, and you didn't risk anything or almost anything, even well, sometimes KGB were there. But I think it was this urge and need to express yourself in a sincere way that was the bond between people, between these close people, and that led them to risk their lives for them 25th of August and 68, they went out and protested, and people who didn't know about it were angry, because if they knew, they would go and support their friends, not because, well, of course, because Prague was invaded by tanks, but because friends were there and they wanted to support them. So I think this is also a partial explanation of this kind of friendship, which is quite difficult for us to understand, because, well, I don't know how many of us could risk his own life or her own life for a friend, which is really noble, but it sounds quite romantic nowadays, no? And I wanted to add something about what you mentioned at the end of your reply about what I think is the great absent in the book, the coming worth of the book, which is the Soviet society. When you said that to the extreme, we can think about no Soviet society at all in those decades. This gives me also always kind of frustration when I think or research about the Soviet dissidents, because it's like they are talking to the state, or they're trying to talk to the state, the government, the party, but at the same time, they are trying to interact with the society as a whole, with the regular guys in the streets, and it feels like they are nowhere. And this is something that, of course, we are now linking to today's situation. When I'm constantly asked when I talk about memorial and the situation with the Russian opposition, is there a consensus in the society? Are they against, or are they supportive of the government, of their choices? And this question really makes me crazy and frustrated, because the polls, the numbers, and the actions, or rather the lack of action of the society, leads us to think that the majority of the Soviet society then and the Russian society now does agree with what is going on. And they wanted to, in the Soviet times, of course, they were afraid. There was the kind of fear, general fear, but always looked at the dissidents as hostile people, as different people. And paradoxically, the dissident always, I mean, this is my impression, they didn't really want to get in touch with the Soviet society. There was this kind of, you call it the intellectual individualism, this kind of elitist feeling of being something different. And at the same time, you were protesting on a square. So you did want people to look at you and to question their behavior. So this is one of the thousands, I think, paradoxes of the Soviet dissident. And I would like to ask you, based on the material and the information you studied, what's the interaction between dissidents, the Soviet society, and the state? Yeah.
Yes, the dissidents did become very elitist by the 1970s. And it's not so much that they failed to build bridges to Soviet society, it's that they barely tried. Because I think they had a profound distrust of much of the population around them. It's interesting, you drew our attention to their eagerness to communicate with the Soviet state, but the other audience that they were eager to communicate with and were phenomenally successful at communicating with was the West. That's something that really transformed their influence in the context of the Cold War, because it's one thing to try to harness Soviet law in an attempt to place certain constraints on the Soviet state. It's a very clever strategy, but it didn't really work because the Soviet state did not become more law-abiding. It's a very different thing to use international law and human rights and appeal to Western governments saying, you've signed treaties with Moscow, and Moscow was not honoring parts of those treaties, therefore we need to do something. That was a very powerful move, but also a very dangerous move because it inserted dissidents into Soviet foreign policy, and like most authoritarian governments, the Kremlin was extremely jealous of its monopoly on foreign policy. And this is what eventually produced the final crackdown on the movement by the KGB. The relationship with the rest of the Soviet population is really a bit of an enigma. We don't know, and we may never know what the spectrum of opinion was among Soviet citizens. We don't have polling data to show us. And because there weren't multi-party elections, we don't even have the indirect mechanism of, who voted for this group and who voted for that group to give us a rough sense of the distribution of opinion. It's just really hard and maybe impossible to know what the Soviet masses, so-called, thought about the dissidents. What we know is that the dissidents were very suspicious of the Soviet population and assumed that they were largely unsympathetic, except for the intelligentsia, the urban intelligentsia. I think many of the same challenges apply today. You said a few things about the degree of support by the Russian population, the population of today's Russian Federation, for the war against Ukraine. I mean, the polling data supports what you say, which is that a very strong majority of the Russian population supports the war. But we know from past experience that public opinion is extremely malleable, and it can be pushed and massaged in certain directions by the state, which controls the massive propaganda needs. So I'm always a little bit skeptical about people who claim to know what the Russian population thinks or feels about an issue. It just seems like a very unstable context to try to measure something. What we do know is that the state exercises an almost complete monopoly on television. It used to be that the internet in Russia was a very free space. You could find pretty much everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, beautiful. That's no longer true. The Russian internet now is much more like the Chinese internet. It's highly regulated by the state. Okay, there are people who have what they call virtual private networks, VPNs that allow them to go around the official censorship, but not that many people have VPNs, out of a country of roughly 150 million. So we're back in a situation where we don't know really what the spread of opinion is.
The microphone. I suppose if there are no more questions or remarks, I believe the building needs to close. And but it's a really great opportunity to thank Ben Nathans for sharing his thinking, his thoughts about this topic, and I hope there will be other occasions. So
Thank you.
end this talk with an applause. Thank you very much.